This is the International iAQA certificate for breathing. Having looked at respiration, you should now know that we require glucose and oxygen for respiration to take place. So what we're going to look at here is, well, how do we supply the oxygen to the body so that the cells can carry this out? You need to be familiar with the structure of the breathing system, which forms part of the respiratory system. And in your notes you have a diagram very similar to this, and you need to learn all the different parts of it. Specifically, here in the thorax, you need to identify which bits are the ribs and which bits are the intercostal muscles. The intercostal muscles, there are a pair of them, external and the internal, and they are responsible for lifting the rib cage or pulling it back down again, depending on whether you are breathing in, your rib cage lifts up, or when you breathe out, the rib cage falls and forcing the air back out again. So there's a key point to make note of. Also, inside the respiratory area, the trachea branches out into two left and right bronchi. Remember, the labelling for left and right is the opposite way round to what it would be for you on your body. So this side, as you look at the screen, is actually the right bronchus here, the right lung, and the left on the opposite side. Everything is backwards. Bronchi branch into smaller and smaller bronchioles, these two, and at the very end of the tiniest bronchioles we'll be left with the alveoli, these tiny air sacs, which we'll look at in more detail in a moment. The other labels on the other side, the trachea, this is the open airway connected to the back of the mouth down towards the lungs. Key things about that are that it has rings of cartilage in a C shape so that they're able to provide stiffening and reinforcement for the trachea to stop it collapsing when you're breathing in. We've talked about the rib muscles, the intercostal muscles as they're called, and you should be able to label the lungs, but also the next important item is the diaphragm, a flattened sheet of muscle underneath the lungs, and that moves from to a dome shape or down to a flattened. So here is our lung branching off the right bronchus. At the end of the tiny bronchioles, as we just mentioned, we have these tiny air sacs called alveoli. Over the surface of each alveolus there are many blood vessels. They're there to allow the exchange and the uptake of the oxygen from the air in the lung spaces into the blood vessels where it can be carried off and transported by the rest of the body. The multiple air sacs increase the surface area for maximising uptake of oxygen. And if we take a cross section through one of these, you'll see that here is the air coming in at the end of a small bronchiole, and one of these blood vessels is over the surface of it, whereby that's where the oxygen is going to be exchanged and the CO2 is as well. You can see the carbon dioxide from deoxygenated blood is carried in, diffuses into the alveoli where it goes into the gas form and can be breathed out, and similarly the oxygen coming in comes across the alveoli wall into the blood capillaries and again is transported away. Key features of the lungs are that it has a large surface area caused by the many alveoli, tiny air sacs, and a rich blood supply, essential for maintaining a steep concentration gradient for maximising the rate of diffusion into or out of the lungs. Also, they are moist. That prevents them collapsing, allows them to stick to the walls, and it also aids diffusion because gases like to diffuse a bit better when they're across walls in solution. A fourth point that's worth noting is that the wall of the capillary is only one cell thick, and the wall of the alveolus itself is only one cell thick, therefore meaning that the distance through which the gases have to diffuse is as short as it possibly can be, again maximising the rate at which diffusion can take place. To focus on breathing now, the actual mechanisms of breathing, if you just think very carefully about what happens when you take a big breath in, you should hopefully be able to work out the majority of things. So as you breathe in, known as inspiration, the rib cage must be lifted. That's carried out by the intercostal muscles. And similarly, the diaphragm, which is the sheet of muscle, contracts and flattens underneath the rib cage, therefore making a larger volume inside the rib cage area as possible. The pressure is therefore reduced, meaning that air has a pressure gradient from greater pressure outside to a lower pressure inside, meaning that the air travels in. Similarly, for exhaling, intercostal muscles draw down the rib cage, squeezing on the lungs. The diaphragm relaxes, pushing upwards into the lung space, and therefore the pressure and the volume have decreased. The pressure has increased, the volume has decreased, meaning air is going to be forced out of the lungs. That's exhaling. You need to be able to describe each of those steps with the intercostal muscles in the rib cage and the diaphragm and the result of the changes in volume forcing the air either in or out. You will also need to know about mechanical ways in which ventilation can be assisted, usually in a hospital environment. And there are two main types of ventilators that can take place. There are those that are negative pressure ventilators, where the air is drawn into the lungs, or there are those that are positive pressure ventilators, and these ones, they actually force the air into it. So the converse is pulling the air in versus those where you push the air in. Negative versus positive. You should watch the YouTube clips that are provided in your notes to help with more explanation on that. The final thing you need to know about is how to measure different lung volumes. And there are lots of different tools available to that. You should be reminded of your practicals where you used the large lung volume bags, or the spirometers which you blew into and the little dial was whizzing around. Traditionally, there might well be the spirometer, which is set up here, shows you that you can breathe into a tube, and you've got a series of one-way valves that insist that the air goes around through a chamber of soda lime. Now, soda lime is there and important to remove carbon dioxide, so that as the air cycles around you don't breathe in more carbon dioxide. And there's a floating drum of air which you are filling and removing air from as you breathe, which floats on water. And as you breathe in, the drum goes up and down and draws a line on a specially created bit of graph paper from which you can measure your volumes. A more modern technique would be a digital spirometer, which does essentially exactly the same job but gives you a digital readout instead. These are some examples of the sorts of traces that you might get, and you can look at the size of the peaks, working out the distance between them for a breathing rate, or the height of them, which shows you the volume. And then here is an example of where someone's done a large breath in and a large breath out, as opposed to just your regular breathing, what's called your tidal volume. Finally, to work out the rate at which you can force air out of your lungs, which is a measurement of how dilated and wide your airways are, so your bronchi, bronchioles, etc. Some of you will be familiar with using these from asthma tests. This is a peak flow meter, where a large breath is all forced out in a shorter space of time as possible, and therefore you get a reading. And the wider your airways are, the faster the air comes out, theoretically the healthier you are. Whereas those with chronic asthma problems will have narrower airways, and therefore this value will be low, and that decides whether you need to be given an inhaler to help widen your airways.